We've already mentioned those three big names that are certainly the story coming out of this national title game. But I'm wearing the GOAT hat for a very specific reason, Mitch. Not only because it is the unofficial secret mascot of the Players' Championship here in Northeast Florida, but because Geno Auriemma, now with 12 titles to his game spanning 30 years, the first
Mhm.
title this season since 2016. A lot of folks online want to debate, is he the GOAT, not just of women's basketball coaching, but of all time? Let's start there before we get into the conversation. And of course, Mitch is live in Tampa, so I'm fascinated to hear some of the conversations you've had on Press Row before we dive into the is this the end of the road for Geno conversation.
Yeah. So let's talk about the GOAT thing first. So, yes, I think you could certainly make the case. I think certainly he is the greatest women's basketball coach of all time. Is he the greatest college basketball coach of all time? Probably. I mean, he's got 12 rings now. And then you get into the debate of, okay, is he the greatest coach in any sport? I think maybe more than any other coach has, Gino has dragged his sport into relevancy and like basically made other programs and other schools compete at his level. I think that Gino had this stretch in the mid 2000s where like he had that rival with Pat Summitt at Tennessee, right? And then he had that rivalry with Notre Dame and Muffet McGraw, and he had a little thing with Tara Vanderveer in Stanford. And then you get into the 2010s and he rips off four in a row with those Stewie teams. And at the end of that, Pat Summitt has passed away, unfortunately, and Tennessee is in a bit of a funk. They're not as good as they once were. UConn is and has been for the last 25 years the most iconic program in this sport, the biggest brand and everything else. And I think that run of four in a row with Stewie is the one that really made other programs around the country go, why can't we have what UConn has? And it's like, well, it's very simple. Do you want to invest in women's basketball the way that UConn has? And there are some schools that decided, yes, we do want to do that. And some schools who decided we want to pay our coaches good money and we want to pay our assistant coaches good money and we want to make our facilities better and amenities. And then in this latest era, we want to invest NIL and give our players those opportunities as well. And I think Gino, I think you can give him a large chunk of credit. I heard Courtney Bankard and somebody else talk about this earlier this year when Gino was surpassing first Mike Krzyzewski and then Tara Vanderveer in the all-time wins record. But basically they were saying Gino winning at the level that he did, when it was happening in real time, there were all those like lame columns and talking heads who were like, is UConn bad for women's basketball? And it's like, no, and it turns out in the long run, that run was great. There's a reason why since that four-peat, we haven't had a repeat champion in the sport, and we've had a lot of other different champions. We've had the rise of Dawn Staley at South Carolina. Kim Mulkey's won at two different schools in that span. Got another Stanford title. Got another Notre Dame title. But we've also seen teams like Virginia Tech and Arizona and UCLA make the Final Four for the first time. We saw Iowa resurge, get to the Final Four for the first time since the 90s. So you have all these different programs in all these different parts of the country really investing in women's basketball. And I think Gino deserves a big credit for that. I think he's the reason why, I think coaches and I think administrators saw what UConn had in women's basketball and was like, why can't we do that? And the answer is money. And so it was just putting money in the right hands and empowering the right people and investing the right way. And now you have a lot of different programs in the country who really care about women's college basketball and are really good at it.
And when someone asked me this question prior to the thumping of South Carolina in the national title game, my response was yes, because you can't tell the story of the sport without Geno Auriemma
Absolutely.
and because of the longevity. The other person, though, that you can't tell the history and the story of the sport without is Pat Summitt. And because we lost Pat Summitt relatively prematurely and at the peak of her powers, maybe not so much, but certainly Tennessee was competitive when she had
Yeah.
to step away. And that is where it's hard for me to introduce, with all due respect, and this is not because of the final score today, it's very difficult for me to introduce Dawn Staley into that conversation just yet, knowing that those two figures still exist. And knowing
Yeah.
that one of them, at least as of this writing or this podcast, is still a head coach in women's college basketball. And so I think that part of the story and part of why we can't introduce Dawn into that conversation is because Geno is the undisputed GOAT. And number two, because we lost Pat so early, that it feels like part of that story was left untold. And almost as a homage, she will always be second for that reason. Now, I also would introduce, and this was one of the best responses I saw online when the GOAT debate was raging on this afternoon as the women's national title game was rolling on.
Mhm.
The two names that I saw on the wrestling side of things, Dan Gable, because not
Oh, sure.
only did he bring national titles to Iowa and bring the sport of wrestling, Greco-Roman style wrestling, to the national conscious, but he also was the coach of Olympic teams. And that, of
Yeah.
course, is something that you look at Geno, you look at, Mike Krzyzewski and their involvement with Team USA, and does that play a factor? The modern day version that someone else threw back at this person who said Dan Gable was Cale Sanderson at Penn State, who
Mhm.
has also now led the Nittany Lions on a run that looks a lot like what Gable was able to do in Iowa City once upon a time. But again, the idea of not only have you won double-digit national titles, but you have also dragged a sport into the American consciousness. That, for me, is what signifies if you are actually the GOAT coach of your sport.
Yeah, I think Dan Gable is a pretty good comp. I didn't think of that one. Yeah, and John Wooden, for
Yep.
men's basketball,
Mhm.
I think Geno is right up there with almost any of them, and then you can debate like who's better, who had the more impact and stuff like that. But yeah, to your point about Dawn, I think if she had won today, I would have considered her for sort of a spot on like the women's basketball coaches Mount Rushmore. Um, and she can certainly still get
She
there,
still
but
could
I
get there.
I
Yep.
think right now, I think for me it would be Geno, Pat Summitt, Tara
Tara
Vanderveer, and
Vanderveer.
probably Kim Mulkey. I mean, Kim Mulkey has 4 titles, and she's the only one to do it with 2 different programs. Tara Vanderveer had more wins than
And then
anyone
she
else.
won one as a
So,
player as well. So that's
right.
technically great.
Before Geno surpassed her earlier this year and, basically made Stanford into the powerhouse that it is. I mean, I think Tara deserves a little bit more credit because like it's harder to win at Stanford than it is a UConn or a Tennessee just because of all the constraints. But yeah, I think that would be like my Mount Rushmore at the moment. Geno, Pat, Tara, and Kim Mulkey. But I think certainly like there is time for Dawn to squeeze her way in there. She's certainly on her way. I think if you asked me to pick a 5th person, it's probably her. Yeah, so I think this one like firmly establishes Geno as the GOAT women's basketball coach. I think he already was, but like a GOAT among the greatest coaches in any sport.
Can I jump in here real quick?
Uh-oh.
And I'm going to, I mean, look, you guys know me well enough. I'm going to argue for Nick Saban. However, my argument for Nick Saban is actually kind of an argument for Geno too. I don't know that Dawn would fall into this. I don't even know that Kim would fall into this so much. To establish dominance in your sport when the sport is, or excuse me, in 2 very different eras of your sport, I think is really hard to do. And I guess if I'm saying Saban did that in football, I guess Kim Mulkey's career in basketball sort of spans the same year. So yeah, let's include Kim in this conversation. But I think that it is really hard. Let me rephrase. For Geno to get started was much easier than it is to now climb back to the top of the mountain. But the fact that he did it and the fact that from when he started to the Stewie years to now, like college football, you had pre-BCS, post-BCS, right?
Mhm.
Like just pre-CFP, post-CFP. Those are 2 distinct eras, even though there was something before the BCS. I think you could argue that women's basketball has gone through 3 or 4 in Geno's time.
Yeah. And I think the argument for Saban is like he did it he basically said there was a couple different things, right? Like where he said, okay, this is how you want to play with the passing and with the RPOs and that sort of thing. Okay, I'll evolve if this is how you want to do it. And then the transfer portal came and he said, okay, if this is how you want to do it, I'll evolve and I'll win in this era too. And yeah, to Dimitri's point, the time periods, I think Geno and Nick are about the same age. They've won sort of, in this sort of same time span there.
Yeah, I would put Saban and Coach K in that same bucket if we're to talk
Yes.
about coaches that have had no issue changing the shades of their jacket or their their skins of the lizard or however you want to
Right. The
whatever
game
analogy you
was
want to use.
changing on and off the court, and both of them adapted to it and
If it's
won
one
in
and done's,
different
I'll
eras.
figure it out. If it's
Yeah.
transfer portal, I'll figure it out, and I will continue the song and dance. I'm not gonna lie, producer Dimitri pops on, and I'm like, oh no, did we mess something up? I think a better comp for his argument with Saban and versus Geno and this idea of Saban came into a college football world that, well, yes, is very different than the current one. It was much more established than women's basketball.
Mm.
The better comp is the New York Yankees. Those who question their 27 world titles when the majority of them came in a playoff structure that if you won the American League, you went to the World Series and you did not have to actually go through a multi-round postseason. And so I would argue that this idea of, well, Geno had a head start in a previous era, that's much more them than it is, Nick Saban, who I would argue still entered a college football world that maybe it didn't have the parity that we do now see, but it certainly had more parity. For the sake of time, I want to keep the conversation going because I do want to circle back to Dawn and what Dawn's legacy is after this dismantling at the hands of UConn. But first, Mitch, boots on the ground in Tampa, Florida. Did it feel like to you, and I know he just signed a contract extension, did it feel like to you there was a sense in the air that this may be it for Geno Auriemma?
Mostly no, except there was this moment in the post-game press conference where he was basically talking about how, people told him he should have retired after the last Stewie title. And then kind of the years went by and he felt like he needed to prove something, like he needed to be able to do it, I guess, without Stewie or without that specific group. And he basically said, if we had won the title in Page's sophomore year where they lost to South Carolina and Minneapolis, maybe he left. Maybe he would have left then. But then as it went on and as Paige had her injury and then came back from that, he said, I believe he said, her journey became my journey. But I feel like
her journey's over.
Right. But I also feel like if you're him, I mean, there's no real signs of him slowing down from a physical or mental standpoint. And you have this team with Sarah Strong and AZ Fudd next year. And Sarah Strong seems to me to be like a unicorn, once in a lifetime player in terms of just her combination of size and court vision and passing and scoring ability and skill. Whatever WNBA draft she enters in, she's going to be the number 1 overall pick. So I kind of wonder, maybe that is the player that he goes off into the sunset with. But we'll see. If you asked me to bet on it, I would say no, this is not it for Geno. I think at the very least, we see him run next year back.
As Kevin, my boyfriend, likes to say, everything in Mia's world always comes back to the University of Iowa. And so that's where I ask you, Mitch, because you were at the Final Four in Cleveland last year. If I had asked you that question 1 year ago today about Lisa Bluter and said, do you think she hangs it up? What would you have said?
I would have said no. I didn't see that one coming at all.
And here we are. And for Lisa, it was a lot. It was a couple different things. It was, look, Caitlin Clark is a generational player. As much as Addie Deal is going to be electric when she arrives in Iowa City this summer, I can't guarantee it. I can't guarantee, no one can, that will be similar lightning in a bottle to what 4 years of Caitlin Clark brought to Lisa Bluter and her program, which had already gone to the Elite Eight 2 years prior to Caitlin arriving on campus and was reaching the pinnacle of the sport prior to her arrival, and then obviously entered a different stratosphere. I also think, and Lisa was very open about this, wanted to see her son, his final season of college basketball, in Grinnell in central Iowa. And also she wanted to be around her daughters more, wanted to travel with Dave. Shout out Dave. I have Dave's book somewhere here in my bookshelf, her husband. And I applaud that. In the same vein as I was stunned by Nick Saban hanging it up, and apparently that was him and Miss Terry kind of looking at each other and saying that they wanted to travel. Roy Williams has made it very well known, and now we have seen it over the last 4 or 5 years. That man wants to see every minor league baseball park in America. He wants to go to every college basketball arena in America. I don't know what hobbies Geno has outside of basketball. I was worried about Nick Saban because he didn't have hobbies. Roy Williams and Lisa Bluter have hobbies. They have people that they want to travel with.
Yeah.
Just like I'm worried about Kirby Smart. Like, I am genuinely worried about the guy because he likes golf, but he hates golf. Like, he's only doing it just because they're telling him he has to do something else. I worry that that's the issue with Geno Auriemma. It's not an issue, but it suggests that he's just going to keep doing this until he drops.
I think when Geno retires, we will not hear from him. I think he is going to go to somewhere in Italy, and he's going to be there, and he's going to have some wine, and we will not really see him in the public eye as much as we are seeing Roy Williams or someone like that. Yeah, but I don't think Geno's at that point yet. Like